Um, for those of us who are watching on Zoom, I recommend that you change your viewing mode to speaker view. You can do that by clicking on the icon in the upper right-hand corner. That way, the only person you'll have on your screen will be either Rachel or Keya while they're talking. And then for people both on Zoom and watching from Facebook Live, we will have a Q&A section at the end. So any questions that pop into your mind throughout this conversation, go ahead and leave them either in the comments on Facebook or in the chat on Zoom. And you can find the chat icon at the bottom bar of your screen. And now I'd like to introduce the Executive Director of Ohio Citizen Action, Rachael Belz. So Rachael is both our Executive Director and the Director of our Consumer Rights Project, the Ohio Consumers Power Alliance. She moved to Cincinnati in 1996 from Clean Water Action in Denver to become the Cincinnati Area Program Director for Ohio Citizen Action, and has been a leader in working with communities who are affected by toxic chemical pollution. She's pioneered successful Good Neighbor campaigns and played a key role in calling on Ohio utilities to close their highly polluting plants. Rachael also plays a key role in the statewide coordination of our campaigns as a member of both the executive committee of the REAMP Network and the steering committee of the Power a Clean Future Ohio campaign. Rachael, take it away.
Thank you, Anastasia, and welcome everyone, both on Zoom and Facebook Live. Thanks for being part of our virtual Earth Day programming. This is a special Earth Day. You probably know it's the 50th Earth Day, in fact. It's also the 45th anniversary of Ohio Citizen Action, and that's not a coincidence. Circumstances led us to plan a virtual Earth Day this year because Ohio Citizen Action members are still making a big impact with all of our virtual activities. Ohio Citizen Action is the premier grassroots mobilizing and organizing team in the Midwest, I'm proud to say. We organize and mobilize people in person, by phone, and online, engaging our members and supporters in actions that protect public health, improve environmental quality, and benefit consumers. This Earth Day, as the pandemic continues to wreak havoc, the world is focused on efforts to contain the virus and manage the economic fallout. Yet the climate emergency remains as urgent as ever, and Ohio Citizen Action believes we must continue this critical work as part of these relief efforts. We often have the pleasure of working in coalition with like-minded organizations, including the fantastic network headed up by today's special guest. Keya Chatterjee is Executive Director of U.S. Climate Action Network and author of the book, The Zero Footprint Baby, How to Save the Planet While Raising a Healthy Baby. Her work focuses on building an inclusive movement in support of climate action, and Keya's commentary on climate change policy and sustainability issues has been quoted in dozens of media outlets nationwide. Prior to joining USCAN, she served as Senior Director for Renewable Energy and Footprint Outreach at the World Wildlife Fund, and prior to that was a climate change specialist at USAID and NASA. A former Peace Corps volunteer, Keya received her master's in environmental science from the University of Virginia. We're thrilled to have you here celebrating our first Earth Day with us, our first virtual Earth Day with us. We'll begin today's program with a conversation between Keya and I, and then we'll open it up to your questions. Remember, as Anastasia said in the announcements, please ask your questions in the chat box on Zoom and in the comments for Facebook Live. First of all, Keya, I wanted to ask you, how are you and your team doing during this pandemic crisis? And what's been the biggest challenge or challenges in adjusting to the new normal you've already seen? Oh, she's muted. She needs to be unmuted.
There we go. Sorry about that. So thank you so much for having me. It's interesting. Our team was already doing remote work. So in that sense, there were things we were really used to. But I think that for us, a lot of the issue has been that we have this kind of like simmering, underlying rage at the injustices of the world and climate change that's like always there. And it's like, you watch, island nations who did nothing to cause the problem get hit. And then you watch Katrina and Sandy and floods and who gets hit. And it just is, it's this like simmering anger. And for me, it's just turned into like an all-out rage. That for me is like what's been very hard about this is I watch what's happening and like, you know, we're like the richest country in the world and we can't get masks for people who work at grocery stores or even like nurses and doctors. And we like can't get ventilators and tests. And like, how did we end up being the epicenter of this? And then on top of that, seeing all the people who have been slammed by climate crises getting slammed again, you know, Queens, New York, New Orleans, Detroit, all the people who've been like super slammed by environmental injustice are dying again. And it just has, it's made me feel this sense of fury in this moment that, you know, like there's obviously like moments of grieving but like I just, you know, I'm struggling to kind of like get past the fury that we have allowed this to happen to ourselves and to the people who are most vulnerable around us.
Again. Right. No, that's a really good point. And I think that encapsulates it for probably a lot of folks watching today and other, you know, members of ours, both of our networks and our organizations is rage. I think you're absolutely right. And it's, I don't know about you, but it's always kind of part of our work, but, and then sometimes, you know, it just really flares up in some really big instance. And yet it's never the whole world at the same time.
Yeah.
You know, it's maybe this is going on in a state and that's bad enough, or this is happening in another country. And you're right. It's just, as everybody said, it's unprecedented. So it's unprecedented for all of us. Okay. So that actually led me into a question as well, which is, what about, I mean, because this also is just, you know, sort of very meta for the whole climate change situation in general. So what do you think about, you know, how do you talk about the importance of maintaining our focus on climate change, even during the pandemic and the unusual times we have, and, you know, and really all the uncertainty, because that's also a whole area of uncertainty that some people have been struggling with for a long time.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many parallels in what we're viewing right now with the climate crisis and the ongoing climate emergency. So for me, a lot of what comes up is just thinking about those parallels a lot, you know, like the importance of listening to scientists and people who know what they're talking about and heeding their warnings. Like that's really important. Wouldn't it have been good if we had listened to the epidemiologists and kept that emergency office that was focused on global pandemics? The importance of clean air and clean water. You know, we've seen again how, you know, as I was saying, the communities that don't have access to clean air and clean water are having disproportionate deaths. There was a Harvard study that came out that said a 15% increased likelihood of dying from COVID-19 if you had been exposed to air pollution. So like that importance is so central when we talk about climate change. Both because of climate change causing worse air pollution with heat waves, but also because of that same, you know, the same sources of pollution, like from fossil fuels and agriculture, causing dirty air, and also causing the climate crisis. And so I think there's just a lot of parallels, and then a lot of parallels in the, you know, in the effects too. You know, both pandemics, and of course there's a relationship between disease and climate change already. And what we see is that like, when we have moments of climate disasters, when we have global pandemics, it can destroy the economy really fast. So it's just so wrong-headed to say we can't afford to be prepared for these things and do what we need to do, because these are things that will just, even if you don't care about people, you don't care who dies, and all you care about is money, from just a money point of view, you really should deal with the climate crisis and global pandemics well in advance. And I think another lesson from this moment politically is that like, actually there's plenty of money. You know, when we want to, we can snap our fingers and spend $2 trillion when we need to. And it's, you know, like, you know, we all know like a stitch in time saves 9. Come on, people. We're all like out there selling masks. Like we know about this basic tenet of life. Like we need to spend the money now in order to avoid a much, much worse depressed economy. And then for me, more importantly, so much human suffering that we can avoid. And so there's all these parallels, but then on top of that, these things overlap, right? So we've seen So Climate Action Network is an international network, so we're the U.S. part of it. But our colleagues in Can, Vanuatu had a record-breaking hurricane hit, Category 5, leveled most of the buildings on the island. They could not shelter in place and keep distance anymore. People had to go into shelters in a country that has 2 ventilators. These, any crises are going to overlap, and we already saw in the U.S. Southeast with the tornadoes that came through, and we're just at the beginning of a season where we're going to be getting flooding, hurricanes, fires out west, where it's really hard to keep distance from people if your community is being devastated by a climate-related disaster and you need to find a way to shelter and get to safety. And so these emergencies don't operate like separately and on their own. They're caused, the impacts are caused by the exact same problems, and societal problems that include racism, that includes economic injustice, and they play out in the same communities, and then they start to overlap. And I think I'll just say on the positive side, we really see in the case of this crisis again that we are capable of coming together as communities and responding. We are capable of spending money when we need to. We are capable of doing these things, and we need to remember that, and we need to continue to do them.
That is so true. Absolutely. Yeah, couldn't have said it better myself. Okay, so I wanted to bring up something that we talked about in our first conversation a while ago, because I love the story, and I think this is applicable to the kinds of things that we're talking about in Ohio here too. And it's one of the questions that we struggle with too here in Ohio. Why is it important to make sure that consumer voices are heard? All types of consumer voices. And when you and I first met, we discussed some tactics that I know you helped to pioneer regarding electric utilities. And I wanted you to maybe tell a little bit about that, and also any other creative tactics or pieces of campaigns you've seen that you think are interesting, especially in this kind of virtual era of organizing.
Yeah, thank you. So, there's a organizer called whose name is Gene Sharp, who said there are limited numbers of ways that people have power, and he's written these books that have really informed movements all over the world. And people have power as voters, people have power as taxpayers, people have power as workers, and people have power as consumers. And that's kind of where we get our sources of power. The other side tends to have a lot of money, and we have people. And it's really important that we use all of our sources of power. And they're all really important. So we actually have to use our power as consumers. And that means engaging sometimes in not consuming things. And when we do that in solidarity, it's a really powerful thing to do. So when I was working at World Wildlife Fund, I was involved in something called Earth Hour, that folks may have heard of, where we, it's a very light, fun family thing. We asked people to turn off the lights for an hour to show that they cared about climate change. And what I found in the course of doing that, in conversations with many cities and with utilities, was that utilities actually are a little bit scared of tactics like that. Because, they don't all have, although, if they were really prepared for climate change, they would have a ton of battery storage within their network. But because they're not actually taking it seriously, they're not really prepared for fluctuation. And so when we come together in solidarity as communities and we do things like use less electricity at certain points in time, it catches them off guard. It's kind of like they just don't quite have the resources to deal with that, and they're not used to it, and you get their attention, and then you can make a demand. Similarly, you can use like administrative overload tactics. So like a tactic, not great in a social distancing era, but a tactic that you can use is like paying your bills with change, because they don't have enough people to get that change in and process it. So these are ways of getting their attention and saying like, hey, we're serious as consumers. We're not going to put up with your actions anymore that are hurting us. We are going, and again, like the key is doing it in solidarity and people together. We've been working on, and I think I mentioned this to you in passing, Rachel, we've been working on planning a big solidarity national effort called Arm in Arm, which is like a metaphor for solidarity. And the term that we've been using there is disruptive humanitarianism. And we came up with this term because we felt like we do feel like it's important to disrupt the system because the system is causing people to die, and we need to change the system. And so we want to disrupt the system, but we want to do it in a way that actually shows our humanitarianism. So it acts like guerrilla gardening. So what if that developer owns that plot of land? We're gonna plant some food there. We're gonna plant an orchard there. So what?
I'm taking notes. I'm taking notes. Keep going.
I mean, I don't really care if the city says I'm not allowed to close my road and let my kid outside in the middle of a pandemic. I got cones. I'm going to put them out. We do what we need to do to protect our communities, and we do it through disruptive humanitarianism. And so like a big scale example would be something like Occupy Sandy, where when Superstorm Sandy hit, the community came together and said, the government is not responding, it's not helping our people. So we are going to set up a political education process that brings people in, explains the problem, but also just gets food and supplies out to people, help people charge their phones, help, just helping people in a moment, but doing it in a way that is really pointing out the deep systemic flaws and the failure of government to do something. Like, why is it I have to be out there with a cone so my kid can just go outside for 20 minutes? Why is the city not coming through and saying like, hey, residential streets are going to be closed, on these hours every day, so that I'm not out there trying to like block, drivers going 50 miles an hour through neighborhood streets just so we can go outside for a few minutes. And similarly, like, why is it that I have to go plant an orchard when people are food insecure and don't have access to food? Why is that something that we are doing collectively? Like, why have we even allowed these food deserts to take hold? Sure. And I can keep going with examples, but like, one that we talked about is like, why are there utility shutoffs happening right now in the middle of a pandemic, right? And like, how can we be in solidarity with the people who are experiencing that outrageous act of having their water or electricity taken away from them in the middle of a pandemic? Well, again, like, we can shut off our electricity in solidarity, and that will be disruptive to the system when we do it together, get their attention so we can make a demand and get things to change. And I actually, just so you guys know, I did the thing with the cones in front of my street. I had 10 other people do it on 10 other streets, and we got concessions from the mayor of DC, who finally said, you're right, we do need to widen sidewalks so people can walk to the grocery store safely and stay far from people. And so like, you can walk outside for a few minutes. So it works is a great thing about it.
That's the thing. A lot of people don't realize how sometimes, not always, you can't count on it, but sometimes even small group actions, if they're done just right and it's just exactly the right, tone, and the decision maker, the target, or whatever you want to say, but the decision maker, yeah, exactly. Oh, that's great. I love that story. That's a really good story. Okay, another thing. So I love the way that USCAN talks about building trust as the bedrock of making lasting inclusive change. Can you talk a little bit more about that and how you see that in your work showing up?
Yeah, I mean, for us, at the end of the day, everything we're able to do is about relationships. And so if you think about the time we're in right now, how are vulnerable people even able to get like food? If you get sick in your house, how are you able to get food? Like, you can't get up and cook because of a relationship you've built with somebody and trust you've built with that person over time. And so, like, if a neighbor gets sick, you want to have a trusting relationship with them so that when they text you and are like, I'm really sick, I can't get up, you're going to go drop off 3 meals a day on their doorstep so they can come out and get it. And in the end, like, society works through relationships, and movements work through relationships too. And so, I've been thinking a lot about the Great Depression and how we came out of that with the New Deal, and the amount of organizing that took place in a time when there was no money. There was really no money, and people organized and forced action and got the New Deal. It really came through organizing, and we are in a moment like that now, where like people need to organize despite a lack of financial resources at the scale that we would need to do it. And we're going to have to get a new system out of this, a Green New Deal, if you will. And so what that takes is trust. And so that's why so much of our emphasis is on trust, because we feel like at the end of the day, like the trust we have between each other will determine whether or not we are able to succeed in what we're doing. And trust takes vulnerability and being willing to share like what's going on with you on an interpersonal level. And so a lot of what we do is bring people together to build up that trust, so that as a movement, we have the maximal power to get climate justice.
Right. Well, and it's funny because, you know, you're right. Whether you're in a movement or whether you're talking about human to human, trust builds, you know, often slowly and deliberately, and is reciprocal. So that's tricky, you know, oftentimes, and that's what makes and breaks good movements and coalitions and campaigns and all kinds of things oftentimes. So I'm glad you mentioned that. Let me check the time. So I had a couple of other questions. We're talking, there's various staff members and board members who helped come up with some good questions to help me think about some of this. And one of the things, you have so many, so it's maybe hard to limit, but you've worked in so many different impressive organizations and projects. Can you talk about some of your past research and what it entailed and how you're seeing it show up now, whether it's in the pandemic or just in the climate movement in general?
Yeah, so I mean, I have spent, my actual formal training is bizarrely as an ecologist. So that is how I ended up starting my career working at NASA. So I started my career working at NASA doing remote sensing work. And I just was so alarmed by what I was seeing. And for me, like I started working on climate change on a specific day because I was alarmed at Arctic sea ice data I was seeing. And most people are not that affected by sea ice data, but I saw it in 2002, and I just went to my boss and I was like, I need to work on climate change. And actually at the time I'm still probably very naive in many ways, but I was definitely very naive then. And I was just like, wow, like people must not know. They must not understand that planets that like don't have polar ice caps operate differently from ones who do. And they must not actually understand the crisis that we're in, or else they wouldn't be acting this way. And so I started doing all this research into social science. I changed my job, started working in I'm doing communications of climate science in that program at NASA, and started really researching like what makes people tick, what makes people change their behavior, address a crisis. And what I found is that it's something called the knowledge deficit model, which is that people actually don't act based on pieces of information at all. It has nothing to do with how they act. And this was like very fascinating to me as a person who had been trained in the accumulation of knowledge as a scientist, and that like people would care about that knowledge. But it turns out they don't care. People don't act based on knowledge. They act based on their identity and their tribe. They act based on things that are largely from the neck down, and not based on facts. And so that to me was really important to understand, and then started doing more and more research into like, how do you create fast and deep change? Because the kinds of change we're talking about really has to happen pretty fast and has to stick. And so what we found over and over when we were like as a team studying this, and this was like through many places where I worked, was that there are certain things that are true across movements in history. And the good thing is that humans are really capable of pretty amazing things. And when you start to study movements and look at like the Indian independence movement, which my grandparents were a part of, the US civil rights movement, the anti-apartheid movement, but more recently, incredible movements in South Korea and Hong Kong, and really just people achieving incredible change in short periods of time. You find there are certain elements that keep reappearing, and certain tactics that keep reappearing. One thing is that like we know fast and deep change requires three things. It requires political leadership. It requires an activist base, people who are willing to do that kind of, direct action, disruptive humanitarianism, and it requires a permissive majority. So everything you do has to, in its way of working, appeal to people who are neutral in society, and show to them the injustices of this. They might not like what you're doing, but the image still tells them that like actually, maybe my values mean I should be with these activists. And so, like, as an example, when you look at historical records of the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, you find a lot of people talking about the Freedom Riders as like troublemakers. Like, well, why are they trying to cause trouble by white and black people getting in buses together? But what you find is that even though they didn't like the Freedom Riders, they changed their views. They saw they saw that tactic, and they actually then cared more about racial justice. They saw it as a problem. They saw segregation as a problem. And it moved them, and you started to have that majority of the country who really felt we cannot allow Jim Crow to persist. And you see that, that kind of example over and over in human history, throughout different countries, throughout different times, that we can, get the activist base to act and do it in a way that just makes the neutrals uncomfortable and realize that their values aren't aligned with the opposition, but in fact, their values are aligned with the activists, even if they don't like them.
Even if they don't like them. That, we've actually seen that come true sometimes too. At Ohio Citizen Action, we worked in corporate campaigns and things, and sometimes all the way at the end of the process, you end up with people who, I remember a particular plant manager who literally started kind of giving a little speech about how he changed his black hat to white by actually listening. To really listen to the people in the community and the people we had brought together and all this. And it was, kind of interesting. And it was, and then he and I actually did a couple of speeches together. And he said, it really changed me. It changed my company, and it changed, my relationship with my workers. So you do see that. You never know when you're going to exactly encounter that type of human that is ready for that. But you're absolutely right. Okay. So you and I know both love working with younger activists and probably have a lot in our careers. What kind of advice would you give to younger activists, people getting started either in the movement, volunteer, career, or intern, anything along those lines?
Yeah, join up. I feel like the younger activists have shown the way. I feel like I've learned so much more than I have ever been able to impart on younger activists. Between the Fridays for Our Future initiative, and Greta Thunberg obviously has been very recognized for that, but there are also many, many other young people around this country and around the world who've been leading that movement. Also, the Sunrise Movement has been organizing young people who are under 35 to set up their own hubs and take actions. Like for me, I've never seen such a rich landscape where young people could plug in and really find a path to leadership. It's not, whatever your skill set is, there's a place where you can join up and plug that skill set in. To the work that young people are doing. And so that's my core advice to any young person is like, there are so many opportunities around you. Just jump in and join.
I totally agree. And you're right. There's so many opportunities. There's so many different issues that need help, that need, a new set of eyes, some new suggestions, new tactics. Yeah, absolutely. And, we do, I feel mainly old when I'm hanging out with my staff, some of whom I'm sure are watching this, because they're so much younger. They're so much more talented than I was at their age. So, you're absolutely right. We all have to keep growing within ourselves and within our movements. And so I know we both share that. Okay, so this one actually was from one of my staff members, and so I didn't actually listen to this podcast, but this was how the question came. I thought it was very interesting. She said, I once listened to a podcast discussing the criticism that the environmental movement could be stronger if it had a clearer, more unified message. In some ways, I agree with this. Do you think there's truth to this? And do you think energy and equity campaigns can help in this?
Yeah, so there's always this tension in movements throughout history between autonomy and unity. And both are really necessary. And so yes, I would agree. Like that we do need to have more moments of messaging unity and unity. But we also need to have more autonomy. But those, and there's a healthy tension between those things. And the reality is that every community needs to have the autonomy to fight the fight that is hurting their people the most. And that feels resonant for them because it needs to be fought in their community. That said, we also need to have moments of unity where we say, you know what? This is a time where we are asking everybody to come together and all together participate in a boycott of this thing for this reason. And numbers matter when you're doing boycotts. Numbers matter when you're doing work stoppages. You want to have 3.5% of the population, which is this number that comes from Erica Chenoweth's research on overthrowing dictators, but kind of appears over and over again that like it's very hard to lose if you have those kinds of numbers. And many win with much less than 3.5% of the population. But numbers do matter. It also matters how creative you are. You know, like all kinds of things matter, but numbers matter. And so you have to have moments of unity and moments of messaging unity. I think sometimes people mistake that for like movements then will win if they're very command and control. And if we decide the message here and everyone follows that message. That will never work. You will never have enough people because there will never be enough people who care about that centralized message. And so you have to have autonomy. And like, this is where, you know, localized campaigns come in, is like, that's how a movement builds its numbers, honestly, is by having a local campaign on a local issue that is affecting people directly, and then bring in everyone who's affected by it, and then bring people through a process of understanding, like, this is what we're facing in our community. We're not alone. Other communities are facing this too, all over this country, all over the world. We are, you know, like, we are united in that a very small minority of people is trying to hurt all of us. And so there are times when we're going to want to join forces with others and call for things together. So while people might come in because they really want a very specific change on a local issue, what we need to do if we want to have a movement and moments of unity is bring people through an education process of understanding some of the universal systemic problems that have led to the immediate near-term problem they're feeling, and help them to feel part of a bigger movement.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And actually, I don't even know if you meant to, but it segues perfectly into something that Ohio Citizen Action has started to do, which is to work there have been many states and communities across the nation doing, you know, carbon reduction campaigns and things of that nature, of equitable ways to improve your communities. And we started pre-pandemic, and it was going great guns, so we'll come back. We are part of the Power Clean Future Ohio campaign, which kicked off, and we're sort of part of the grassroots engine of it in a lot of ways. But what it's about is local community-driven change that we can make happen in Ohio, whether that has to do with renewable energy, cutting energy waste, you know, keeping carbon in the ground. We've been learning from different states' programs that have popped up over the years along these lines. And you're right, the local work is exactly where it's at, because when people get involved more locally, no matter what else they're involved in, they feel more connected, you know?
Absolutely.
Which is really helpful. And it's also true for really most of us anyway. I want to remind people that you can put questions in the chat. We're going to open that up in a minute. I have one more question I'm going to ask for sure. We can also do that on Facebook, and they will shoot them over to me and make sure that I know. So one of the other questions that that was brought up that I wanted to hit on, I got to look for it here. Okay, so I thought this was kind of a fun one that I think you'll have a good take on. How do we fight back against the neoliberal order and the World Trade Organization mandating open markets, even at the detriment of a habitable Earth?
Yeah, I mean, this gets to the core of the change we need to make, and I think the reality is that, like, we're an international network, so we have member organizations around the world who then have individual members, and we need to have moments of unity to force change. I don't think there's any answer other than the one I already gave, which is that people have power in a limited number of ways. We have power when we vote. If we have functioning democracies, then our votes count and are more important than money that gets spent. But even if we don't have functioning democracies, people get change all the time throughout history and throughout geographies, and we do it by using our power as taxpayers, our power as consumers, and our power as workers. And I think the reality is that to change a system as deeply entrenched as the neoliberal world order that we have today, I think it will take us using in coordinated ways our power as consumers and our power as workers. And that means we need to, and the good news is we know, like in this country, we know from polling that there are 13 million Americans that are willing to risk arrest in order to tackle the issue of climate change. That is a huge number. That's actually more than 3.5% of the population. And so, okay, granted, maybe some people are fibbing because it's a poll and who's gonna know, I don't actually have to risk arrest, but they feel that sentiment. They feel so strongly about this, that this is about our kids having food and water, and I'm willing to put my body on the line. Those people are out there. They are waiting to be called upon. The one thing I'll say in that poll, the question was asked as, if you were asked, would you risk arrest? Oh. And most people, what they're saying is, well, nobody's asking me.
Nobody's asking.
And so, I've mentioned this kind of vaguely, but we're about to launch something called Arm in Arm, which is a big solidarity movement where we ask people to pledge to doing those kinds of acts together, to doing boycotts, to doing work stoppages, so that we can have those moments of unity, recognizing that the real organizing happens in the moments of autonomy, but we have to have the moments of unity to overcome those entrenched systems. The systems in this country are really built purposefully. It's not an accident, are purposefully built so that people of color in marginalized communities are hurt no matter what the crisis is that occurs. It's not an accident that Detroit gets hit by things over and over, that New Orleans get hit by things over and over. And so it's an entrenched system. And people sometimes find it shocking when I say this, but I think if we're honest with ourselves, we can see that the country is run by white nationalists who are in bed with oil and gas billionaires who are aligned with people who want us to be in a constant state of war. They're warmongering imperialists. And they align themselves with people who, lead with hate of anyone that's different, who don't want, women to have a lot of power, don't hate gay people, hate transgender people. And that alignment is very deep, and it defines the common sense of this country. If we're going to go up against white nationalists and oil oligarchs, we are going to have to use our power to do that. And they're the ones that are kind of establishing this common sense of neoliberalism. And again, it's going to take us really using our power as people to shake out that power and put in place the power structures that have brought us a better common sense. So if the common sense now is everybody should take care of themselves, a New Deal kind of common sense is we should take care of each other. That's the social contract. We take care of each other. And that alignment that brought us the New Deal was the environmental movement, but also the women's rights movement, the peace movement, the civil rights movement, the disability justice movement. And so we can create a different kind of power structure in this country, and we know it because we've had it before. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't, we can make it even better, I think, but we can absolutely use the power that we have to dismantle the current common sense and get to a common sense where we all understand that we're in this together, and that it is on purpose that certain people have been hurt over and over again, and we're not willing to tolerate that anymore.
Right, absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned so much about the front lines, because that's so critical to everything that's happening, but everything that's already been happening. Here's a question for us, and this is one of those great moments in the podcast where we get to get some props as women. So here it says, "Hello, thank you for sharing the conversation with us today. As a young woman in college right now studying environmental policy, it's so inspiring to see two powerful female leaders in the environmental movement. I hope to do work like you both have done in the future." I agree with her. The question is this. You mentioned it's difficult to get people to take action and care because they don't care about facts. So how do we get average citizens to care about environmental change? In 1970, there was the huge nationwide demonstration on the first Earth Day, but sadly, we don't see people care as much about the Earth today, or at least they certainly do in different ways. So it's kind of a broad question, but it's a good one.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think fundamentally people don't care about facts, but they do care about you. And so if you've got, whatever, an Uncle Joe who's like, oh, these environmentalists, they just want to take your hamburgers and, I have no idea what accent I'm doing. I'm sorry, that's super offensive. But anyway, I don't know if your Uncle Joe talks like that. Sorry about that. But let's say you have someone in your family who just has this thing about environment. They might not care about the environment, but they do care about you. And that's the starting point for every conversation you have to have with people is, and it gets back to trust and relationships and building that over time, is that if a person cares about you and you care about something, you can bring them in. You can bring people in one by talking to them. That's not going to get us to scale, which is why we also use the combination of that one-on-one organizing. You use that in combination with these mass action things like freedom rides, right? Folks have heard of Standing Rock. It was, where a pipeline is being built through the Standing Rock Sioux, it's Dakota Access Pipeline being built through Standing Rock Sioux land. That's a moment where, you have to, those actions just expose the moral, the lack of morality of our opposition. They're, setting dogs on indigenous people who are on their own land and just want clean water. So you have to have those acts of moral protest that make it into the media and into stories and spread, and bring, and make those neutrals uncomfortable. But at the same time, you always have to be having those one-on-one conversations that, though they can't get to scale, always help you keep in the top of your minds, what can appeal to neutrals. So that when you're designing the moral protest actions, you've got those people in mind. The people doing the protest, your activists, your audience is the neutrals, always want to understand them. So keep talking to those folks in your life. I guarantee they love and care about you, whether or not they think they love and care about the issues you care about. They will if you talk to them about it.
That's true. That's true. Which leads me to one of my questions, which was I meant to ask, which is, does your family understand what you do? And I just mean family generally, broadly, however you want to answer.
Yeah, I mean, so my kid is more of an activist than I am in a lot of ways, and so my immediate nuclear family is fully on board, totally there. We're in a house with solar panels and batteries. We're all vegetarian. We have we have an 800 square foot house. We grow some food. We have the CSA. We're total caricatures of ourselves. Don't own a car, cargo bike. And then my extended family is, union organizers. My dad built coal-fired power plants for most of his career. My college education was funded by the building of coal-fired power plants that I now try to figure out how do we shut those down and find a new job for all those workers and a way that we take care of everybody so they can have better jobs in those jobs. But, my dad's interestingly super supportive of what I do, and he gets it. And, he'll say, when I got into my career, we thought that burning coal was something that was, really good for communities and bringing them light and electricity. We actually didn't understand the depths of the damage it was causing. And so I think we have to separate out really people who work in those circumstances from the people who do know and have known and, #Exxon knew executives of these companies have known, for my entire life, it's now documented, have known that they were destabilizing the climate so that it wouldn't support food and water. And so those are two separate things in my mind. And so while, that's what my dad did for a living, like he's fully on board with with me being an activist and activism, and like really does understand. And I think that that's true of a lot more people than we might realize who work in those sectors.
Yeah, that's true. We had a comment that says, I love that you come from a coal family. Me too. Hashtag white sheep of the family. Another question. We talked a little bit about the pandemic, but stimulus measures aimed at easing COVID-19's economic shock could also aim to drive emissions reductions too, by funding low carbon infrastructure, offering online trading for green economy jobs, newly unemployed workers, for instance, a lot of the just transition we've been talking about. What's your sense of the idea, and what's the best path forward?
Yeah, I mean, this is some of the work that we were looking at. I was with a group that launched something called the People's Bailout, where we were saying that like the bailout money should go for health, it should go to people, it should not go to corporations. And there should be, a down payment on a regenerative economy as we're investing in infrastructure. So it's a great idea. It's really important that it happen. What we found is a total resistance. No one will be shocked to hear this on the part of the Republicans in the Senate and the White House to doing anything, even when industry wants it. That would make less pollution. They're they really are run by these oil and gas. And in fact, you see that like literally Trump is meeting with oil and gas billionaires in the middle of a global pandemic, not meeting with farmers, not meeting with bus drivers, not meeting with doctors, not meeting with nurses, meeting with oil and gas billionaires. That is what he's spending his time doing. But that said, we have to get this done. We have to get this money spent in a way that turns things around because we're running out of time. And so we know, again, that the Great Depression led to the New Deal. We know we're in a massive economic downturn right now, and it's got to lead to this kind of green stimulus, whatever you want to call it. A Green New Deal analogy works with the Depression to New Deal, this moment to Green New Deal. It has to happen, and we are going to have to force it to happen, even though it's a total common sense thing to do, and absolutely what should be done. It is going to take a massive people's movement to force it to happen. And quite frankly, we will have to have different people in power. And even on top of having different people in power, we will have to force it to happen, because the systems that are in place and entrenched really run deep, and they're not going away without a fight. I mean,
yeah, I agree. And even being in this movement for so long and understanding the entrenchment of the systems, I don't know about you, but I was very almost surprised. I guess maybe this is the naivete I'm here for, but that so much of our presidency rested on decorum before 2016. That doesn't matter anymore, just out the window. Yeah. It's just decorum. So yeah, kind of crazy. Okay, one of the questions is, I'm currently in New York working for a grassroots organization. There's a lot of sentiment that is deeply driving this work. In the beginning, you mentioned anger is an important motivating factor for action. As a human, I've experienced and witnessed anger as a force that becomes stifling, especially when it manifests as resentment and grief. How do you channel that energy in a productive manner to re-engage people who've moved to a state of complacency because of the exhaustion or burnout that often present as a symptom?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that people, there's a sense of overwhelm that comes a lot in the activist community. And I just want to separate out, like, I think that sometimes what we see in the public that we see as complacency is actually much more a sense of helplessness. And what you're seeing is people feel helpless. They don't know exactly what to do. And that manifests as what seems like complacency. What I see in movement spaces a lot more is that people are overwhelmed by their emotion. And that kind of manifests in what looks like a sense of complacency. I think that like the reality is that I believe in a world where we take care of each other. That includes a world where we take care of our bodies and our spirits and allow ourselves time and space to heal when we are grieving. Like right now, everyone is in some kind of state of grieving because there's something about the normal of our lives has been upended. We have to treat people like people, like humans who need time and space and love and caring. And so I think that sometimes we get into a frenzied pace of work and feel like that's more important than taking care of ourselves. But the whole reason we're doing the work is to get a world where we take care of ourselves. So why would we do it in a way that models behavior that we don't want? And I think it's a real challenge for us as people who are deep inside the movement to take that time to take care of each other and ourselves, because otherwise it is very overwhelming, and it's also impossible. It is impossible to work at a certain pace for a long period of time. You have to take care of yourself. You have to set boundaries. You have to have, moments where you let your mind think about nothing or something else. So, and so for me, that's quite separate from the sense of complacency that I often see in the people I've been calling kind of like neutrals or passive supporters, where that I feel like is coming from a sense of helplessness. And that's usually best addressed by giving people something to do that will actually make a difference. Not something to do that won't make a difference, but something that will actually make a difference, and helping them see that it will make a difference and helping people feel empowered. So the things that kind of manifest in the same way, but have slightly different solutions. So I think they're caused by different things.
I'm glad you brought up the point about self-care too in that whole concept, because it's something that is so easily lost. Even when, I don't know if you've noticed this, I mean, we probably both have worked with and managed and been peers of people who do that well and those who don't. And it's when we kind of get into, and I can do it too, you almost get in kind of a little bit of martyr sense at times accidentally, right? Well, I want to thank you very much.
Totally do that.
We won't dwell on that too much, but yes, there's a reason that we're still in the work. We haven't won yet, have we? We have a lot more to go, don't we? I want to thank you very much for joining. This has been a lot of fun and probably will not be our last one, and certainly not our last conversation either. I want to thank U.S. Climate Action Network, which is another place, by the way, many networks and opportunities to connect with people just like you, to help, I think, each of us in our work and in our work as staff people and volunteers of organizations to connect to others who understand. That's why it was so fun to be able to talk with you today as well, because when we first met, I mean, we've only met, I think, online. It's just been really fun to be able to talk with you. I have a really quick announcement of the Earth Day Coloring Contest winners. We have 3 categories. I think they're going to show these as I'm talking. Charlotte is in the under 7 category. And Nicholas is in the 7 to 14 category, and Riley is in the 15 and up category. And in these, with the winners, I know that we will be giving out Graders ice cream gift certificates, which will be able to be redeemed, anywhere and online and all kinds of things. So I'm very excited for everybody with that. I also want to remind people to follow Ohio Citizen Action and US CAN via Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Contribute to our hashtag NatureSelfieOhio Earth Day photo splash. Check out the website ohiocitizen.org and our current action to sign a petition to stop utility shutoffs in Ohio, and specifically right now, very focused on Cleveland Public Power. And also sign up for our action list on the homepage and become an Ohio Citizen Action member. Thank you, Keya, very much. Thanks to the audience and our whole staff who really put this together. I do feel like I have a team of producers, even though we're all remote in this moment. It did make me feel a lot more like we were celebrating Earth Day together. So thank you very much for joining us, and have a great rest of your day. Bye, Keya.